Welcome to History 122, American History 2. This is going to be the first of several sections that deal with the late 19th century. We're going to keep coming back to the last 30 or so years of the 19th century in order to understand various aspects of life. In the first section, we're going to be looking at what's going on in the American South. In the next section, we're going to look at industrialization. We're going to look at expansion in the West. We're going to look at urbanization. So we're going to be looking at the late 19th century from various viewpoints. And in this section, we're going to be looking at what's going on in the American South. As you can see on the slide in front of you, I think one could make a convincing argument that the Union definitely won the war. I mean, that is quite obvious. The Confederacy lost. The United States won this conflict. But one could also argue that in some ways, former Confederates won the peace, meaning that by the beginning of the 20th century, many white Southerners were able to restore governments that had established some sense of white supremacy in the states of the former Confederacy, and perhaps did not recover the pre-Civil War South world, but in some respects protected the political power of white Southerners from black political participation. Now, during the war itself, the war did not start out as a war to end slavery. The Civil War, as Lincoln framed it in 1861, was supposed to be a war to restore the Union. He explicitly stated that this was not a war to set slaves free. He did so for a variety of reasons. One, because most white Northerners would not have been motivated to fight a war if they had the sense that this was a war to end slavery. But also Lincoln was concerned about alienating the border states. Slave states like Missouri did not secede from the Union, remained loyal members of the United States, and Lincoln was anxious not to push them towards secession by declaring this a war to end slavery. But by the summer of 1862, it was becoming increasingly clear that slavery would not be able to survive the conflict. Slaves of their own initiative were taking advantage of the chaos caused by the war to flee to northern lines. When they did so, they declared that they were being used by Confederates as laborers to dig Confederate ditches, to haul Confederate wagons, and as such, the Union would confiscate these slaves and declare them contraband of war and refuse to return them back to the South. For their part, many common white soldiers resented the idea of returning these slaves to the South. Their argument was these Southerners had seceded from the United States. Why should they have to do them this big favor by returning slaves to their former masters? And so by the summer of 1862, Lincoln is toying with the idea of transforming this conflict into a war that was not limited in scope, a war of soldier against soldier, but a war increasingly that will be attacking the Confederate economy. And what is at the center of the Confederate economy but slavery? And so in September of 1862, Lincoln issues what becomes known as the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And what Lincoln stated is that unless the states that were seceded from the Union declared their loyalty to the United States by the end of 1862, Lincoln would declare the slaves living in those regions to be free. So this Emancipation Proclamation was very limited, did not apply to slaves in the border states, also did not apply to slaves living in areas that had been reabsorbed into the Union. By this point, for example, the city of New Orleans and the environment around it had been conquered by the Union, reabsorbed into the United States, does not apply there. This only applies to slaves living in areas then in rebellion against the United States. What Lincoln is trying to do is essentially inspire a massive slave insurrection, deprive the Confederate states of the slave labor they will need to drive their economy forward, and to, in some sense, acquire some of that labor for the Union. By the end of the war, roughly 200,000 African American men will be serving in uniform, either in the Navy or in the Army. Many other African Americans, once it becomes clear this is now becoming a war to actually end slavery, will provide assistance to the Union in less formal ways, simply throwing down their farming implements and following Union lines. And increasingly, this war is going to be taking on a character in which there are very few lines between active combatant and civilian. One of the greater examples of that is William Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea. In the summer of 1864, Sherman captured the city of Atlanta in Georgia. When Atlanta fell, it became clear that Sherman was planning to burn at least several important infrastructure sites. The city council wrote Sherman to beg him not to do that. Sherman wrote this long letter back explaining why exactly he had to burn the place to the ground. And he said, now that the war has come home to roost for you, you feel quite differently about it, but where were you 2-3 years ago when shoeless refugees were marching north, begging for food? You were serving as an active supply juncture to feed this rebellion. No one wants this war to end more quickly than I do, says Sherman. And the best way I could make sure this war comes to a speedy end is by completely and utterly destroying the ability of the Confederate States to continue this war effort any longer. So after Atlanta burns, Sherman writes off to Washington and informs Lincoln that he's planning to go dark for a while. He's not going to be hearing from Sherman. He's going to cut off his supply lines. He and his soldiers are going to be living off the land. What ends up happening is Sherman and his army wage a 100-mile wide swath of destruction from Atlanta to Savannah. Whatever food they could carry, they took with them. Crops they couldn't take with them, they burned in the field. Cattle they slaughtered and left to rot. This is an artist's depiction of Sherman's soldiers tearing up rail lines. One of the things they would do would tear up the rail lines, heat them up so that they were malleable, they could be bent, and then they draped them over tree limbs so they had a nice U-shape and could obviously never be used in war again. So by the end of this war, the Confederate States, or the former Confederate States, by the end of 1865, are completely devastated. The environment itself has been often destroyed. Much of Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, much of the region had been destroyed in one way or another. Much of the South's finances before the war had been tied up in slaves. Slaves constituted most of the wealth that white Southerners owned prior to the Civil War. And by the end of the Civil War, not only the Emancipation Proclamation, but by the spring of 1865, the passage of the 13th Amendment, which officially ends slavery, erased all of that money. So in a number of ways, the South is completely devastated by the conflict. And even before the war comes to a close, Abraham Lincoln is searching around for ways to not just restore the Southern economy and heal the wounds of the war itself, but how to bring these Southern states back into the Union. It was clear to most Northerners that they simply couldn't just come back. I mean, I suppose simply at the foundation of this war is the argument that the Southern states could not secede. Lincoln and Republicans in general argued that secessionism was illegal. These secessionist states' governments did not exist. The Confederacy did not exist in any legal way. And so I suppose one could make the argument that when all of those forces were destroyed, then all of the states were just simply back in the Union. But Lincoln and others recognized that simply couldn't be allowed to happen. You can't just simply pretend as if nothing has happened, allow these states to come back into the Union and be co-equal members of the United States. Something had to change. There had to be some fundamental change to the place to ensure that there was not another rebellion in, say, 10 years. So Lincoln's initial plan, which was maybe something of a carrot to the Confederacy to try and convince those states to come back into the Union, became known as the 10% plan. Lincoln argued that once 10% of the voting population swore oaths of loyalty to the United States, that 10% of the population could be used to form new state governments, create new state constitutions, and seek readmittance into the United States. Congress was a bit horrified about this. Most members of Congress felt that this plan was too lenient. They proposed what became known as the Wade-Davis bill, which insisted that there needed to be 50% of the population swearing oaths of loyalty before new state governments could be formed, and readmittance to the Union sought, but it seems likely some sort of a negotiation would have taken place between Lincoln and Congress to find some common ground. But before that could happen, Lincoln was assassinated, and Reconstruction policy falls to his vice president, Andrew Johnson. Once Lincoln died in 1865, the office went to the vice president, Andrew Johnson, who was put into the executive office. And Johnson was intentionally put on the presidential ticket in 1864 because he was known as the loyal senator from Tennessee. Unlike his state, he refused to secede from the Union. He stayed in Congress, continued to represent his state as a senator, indicated that he was the representative of the loyal citizens of Tennessee who had been drawn out of the Union by their rebellious neighbors, and refused to leave a Senate seat. And so as Lincoln was running for re-election in 1864, Johnson was put on the ballot to show the Republican candidate as not a sectional candidate, not just a northern candidate, but a national candidate. And so all of a sudden, that decision to put Johnson on the ticket with Lincoln became of great importance when Lincoln was assassinated. And Republicans in Congress weren't quite sure how Johnson would approach Reconstruction policy. At first, some were hopeful that maybe he would adopt a strong line against the ex-Confederates. In fact, when he came into the Oval Office, he suggested that ex-Confederates, in order to receive citizenship again, would have to come to the White House and receive an official pardon. And for some Republicans, they hoped this was the kind of revenge that they were looking for, that you'd have these ex-Confederates groveling at the White House, begging for forgiveness from the president. The reality, however, was that Johnson handed these out like toilet paper. Everybody gets a pardon from the Oval Office. And so by the fall of 1865, Republicans in Congress were shocked to see the senators and congressmen that were being elected and sent back to Congress from their home states. Some of them were ex-Confederates. One of the members of Congress sent back by his home state was Alexander Stephens, the former vice president of the Confederacy. Republicans responded by refusing to seat these individuals, and Johnson's program of Reconstruction only made him a political non-entity. In the summer of 1865, there were a number of moderate Republicans who were willing to give Johnson a chance, willing to allow for the possibility that maybe the executive branch ought to be directing Reconstruction policy. But by the fall, most Republicans were outraged at what Johnson had done. They were outraged that these ex-Confederates were coming back to Congress as if nothing had happened. And the moderates within the Republican Party tended to ally themselves with the radicals within the Republican Party, with the result that there was a radical Republican movement that had a veto-proof majority. Johnson would typically veto whatever policies were being passed by Congress as far as Reconstruction was concerned. But in most instances, the Republicans in Congress simply overrode the presidential veto and left the president unable to do anything to affect policy. This on the slide in front of you is a picture of one of the more radical Republicans in Congress, Senator Thaddeus Stevens. He reflected the general sentiment of Republicans, which was that they intended to make the states of the former Confederacy significantly different, so that there was no more talk of secession in the future. This excerpt from the Chicago Tribune rather nicely reflects Northern sentiment as well, that gosh darn it, this war meant something, and it better mean something, that all of these people who died in what remains the bloodiest war in American history hopefully did not die in vain, that something substantive was changed because of this war. And if the South is not willing to accept some substantive change, then the North is content to leave them a frog pond. In other words, just completely devastate the region and leave it unrecoverable rather than let them come back as if nothing has changed. One result of the congressional takeover of Reconstruction policy is the Reconstruction Act of 1867. The Reconstruction Act creates districts in the states of the former Confederacy, excluding Tennessee, that were officially Reconstruction administered governments. There was a military occupation. There were not free elections within those states, but instead you had a sort of military occupation, military governors who were going to oversee Reconstruction within the region. You get a repassage of the Freedmen's Bureau despite a presidential veto. And the Freedmen's Bureau was an agency created by the federal government to try and advocate for the interests of the recently freed people of the South. 4 million human beings had been set free first by the Emancipation Proclamation, and then even more set free when the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was passed in 1865, officially ending slavery within the United States forever. As an organization, the Freedmen's Bureau had a wide variety of things that it did. One of the biggest things that it was designed to do was to advocate for the interests of the recently freed people. So they would help negotiate labor contracts, for example. Recently freed people wanted to find work, they wanted to earn a living, and owners of land wanted to find people to work that land. And often beyond that, there was very little that owners of land, former plantation owners who owned lots of slaves, and former slaves could agree upon. The temptation of former slave owners was to try and take advantage of the situation and recreate a condition that was all but slavery in name. So the Freedmen's Bureau helped negotiate these contracts, find lawyers to advocate for the recently freed people, and you get a lot of federal involvement in trying to substantively change the South in significant ways. On the slide in front of you is a map of all of the HBCUs across the Midwest and southeastern portion of the country. And you can see that a great deal of these historically black colleges and universities were created in the era of Reconstruction to try and bring literacy and education to the recently freed population. Before the Civil War, most states of the former Confederacy did not allow for black education at all and explicitly outlawed the teaching of literacy to former slaves or then current slaves. And so one of the big pushes after the Civil War is to bring education to the recently freed people so that they have access to books and have access to public debates. Now, one of the problems with Reconstruction is a fundamental difference in understanding over what freedom means. It's a word we often bandy about today. We all assume we know what freedom means, but when push comes to shove, what exactly is freedom? Many of the former slaves rather expected that once freedom came, they would gain control of the property that they had worked as slaves, but now became owners of the property. One of the more famous examples of land redistribution that many slaves hoped to accomplish after the Civil War is the infamous field order that was issued by General Sherman during the Civil War that issued 40 acres and a mule to some of the slaves or former slaves who were following his army through Georgia. The reality was most slaves, however, hoped that they would retain their population, and instead of chopping up a plantation into 40-acre plots for individual families, that the population as a whole, the community of slaves as a whole, would take charge of the plantation and govern it not as individuals, but as a community. This understanding of what freedom would mean ran counter to the understanding of freedom held by most Republicans in Congress. On the slide in front of you is a document read by a Union officer as he went through the South declaring the slaves free because of the Emancipation Proclamation, but also indicating the limits of the freedom that the slaves could expect. What's interesting about this speech is it has very little of the benefits of freedom, and it states quite explicitly all the stuff that you don't get with freedom. You don't get the house, you don't get the crops, you don't get the land, but you do get not being sold. So for a lot of slaves, this ran counter to how they expected freedom to be implemented. For many former slaves, they expected freedom to mean some kind of economic position, that they would gain control of the land, that they would now be the owners of the plantations that they used to work as slaves, now as owners. But the reality was that most Republicans simply don't have the stomach for that. Thaddeus Stevens, one of the more radical members of Congress from Pennsylvania, did put forward a land redistribution bill, but it simply did not have the support in Congress to be able to be passed. Most Republicans in Congress during Reconstruction believed freedom to be primarily a political condition, not an economic condition. For many former slaves, freedom meant freedom from fear, freedom from being anxious over where you're going to find food the next day. For many Republicans in Congress, however, freedom means access to trials by jury, access to being able to testify in court, the right to vote. These political conditions constituted freedom, not an economic redistribution of land. On the slide in front of you are the so-called Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment ends slavery. The 14th Amendment was designed to deal with these black codes coming out of many of these states of the former Confederacy. Many of them were quite infamous. One example of one of these black codes is there was a law passed in one of the states of the former Confederacy after the Civil War that said, fine, slavery's over, but if you're a person of color in the South, you need to have a pass from your employer if you intend to travel, proving that you're gainfully employed somewhere. If you don't have such a pass, you could be arrested and put into forced labor by the state. When Republicans in the North read this document, they thought, well, gosh, that's basically just slavery. You're not calling it that, but that is an attempt on the part of the states of the former Confederacy to keep slavery, but not call it slavery anymore. So the 14th Amendment puts the national government as a protector of the rights of the recently freed people in the states of the former Confederacy. It's the First Amendment that explicitly states that the rights guaranteed in the Constitution are rights that the federal government will prevent the states from infringing upon. There was not necessarily a sense before this passage that the rights described in the Bill of Rights, for example, in the National Constitution, were rights that had to be respected by the individual states. But because of all the outrage over these black codes passed in the states of the former Confederacy, there's enough momentum behind doing something about it that a national amendment is passed to try and limit the ability of those southern states to infringe upon the rights of the recently freed population. The 15th Amendment recognizes the right of African American men to vote. There was some hope and expectation that this would be a more general recognition of rights. A lot of activists amongst women expected that the 15th Amendment would also recognize the right of women to vote. There was not enough support in Congress to pass such a thing. And instead, what you get is a more limited amendment that recognizes the rights of African American men to vote. Part of the reason that this could pass is many Republicans in Congress recognized that this would allow them to create a viable Republican alternative in the states of the former Confederacy. That in those states, the recently freed population could be expected upon to reliably vote Republican. And most former slaves who could vote did. Many former slaves joined the Republican Party. During Reconstruction, we get the first black representatives and senators sent to Congress, many of them from the states of the former Confederacy. And so Republicans realize if you want to fundamentally change the South and make sure that you don't get secessionism again, what you need to do is create a viable alternative to the state Democratic parties. It was the Democrats who had led the South into secession and civil war. And hopefully, if you have a viable Republican alternative that can win statewide elections, then you can actually prevent secessionism from occurring again because you've fundamentally changed the political culture of the region. So certainly for some members of Congress, creating the 15th Amendment and then having it ratified by the states is a philanthropic gesture recognizing the rights of African American men. But for many other Republicans, it's a politically savvy move to ensure that Republicans can win statewide elections and hopefully keep control over the national government once these states are restored to the Union. Now, the problem with the 15th Amendment is that Republicans cannot simply rely upon black voters to help them win statewide elections. That only in 3 states by the Civil War do you have black majorities. South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana all had black majorities by the Civil War,
And thus, in theory at least in those states, you could rely solely upon black voters to win Republican majorities in statewide elections. But in all the other states of the former Confederacy, black populations represented the minority. So what Republicans were really hoping to accomplish was not all black Republican representation, but rather a black and white political fusion that would allow Republicans to win elections in states like Arkansas or Tennessee. The hope was that black and white voters would find common cause towards a common set of interests that would allow Republicans to draw upon both sets of voters in order to win statewide elections. And in 1865, that's not necessarily a pie-in-the-sky kind of dream. That potentially has some basis in reality. There are quite a few white voters who blame the Democratic Party for the destruction brought upon the states of the Confederacy. That it was the Democratic Party that led the South into secession. Perhaps they should be blamed for it, and maybe the Republicans could potentially gain their vote. That's not what's going to end up happening. Eventually, we're going to get the restoration of democratic rule within the states of the former Confederacy. Lots of different ways in which black voters are prevented from using the franchise, which the 15th Amendment supposedly guaranteed to them. But what does not work in trying to rally white voters in the South against black voters are arguments made by those like Robert Louis Dabney. Dabney was one amongst many writers, including the former Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, who celebrated the pre-war South. They missed the good old days of slavery and the social structure that had existed there, and they called for a restoration of that kind of a social world. For many white voters in the South after the Civil War, that kind of argument just does not work. Many of them blamed the large slave owners for bringing destruction upon the South and were unwilling to back a political movement based upon the premise that they were going to return to a pre-Civil War South. What does tend to work over time, however, are arguments made by men like Ben Tillman. Ben Tillman, who eventually becomes governor and then longtime senator from South Carolina, makes an argument that says that, yes, the pre-Civil War South was bad. Thank goodness that those really rich guys who owned lots of slaves don't control politics around here anymore. Good riddance to that past. But, he says, white voters need to rally together in order to prevent black political participation. Tillman's argument is that when black people gain political power, it means that white people are losing political power. The argument he puts forward is essentially a racial zero-sum game. That if black people achieve political power, it will come at the expense of white people. And so he encourages in South Carolina white people to rally together in a new movement to try and stop black political participation because he feels that this will be bad for all white people, rich or poor, within the state of South Carolina. And in 1876, he leads a campaign to accomplish just that. It's a campaign of violence. He's a member of an organization in South Carolina called the Red Shirts. In some way, the Red Shirts are like the Ku Klux Klan. They're a paramilitary organization designed to use violence and murder to prevent their opponents from being able to access the polls. Unlike the Ku Klux Klan, the Red Shirts were not a secret organization. Everyone knew who they were, and they showed their faces, but often still indiscriminately murdered people in the streets in order to secure white supremacy within the state. Arguments like Ben Tillman's can be used to rally white people together because of cases like that of Susan Daniels. Susan Daniels becomes a somewhat emblematic case that will be used by men like Ben Tillman to argue that when black people gain political power, it comes at the expense of white people. In 1864, Susan Daniels accused two black men of rape, Henderson and William Cooper. They were brothers. Under that particular time in North Carolina was still a Confederate state government. And so the two men were put on trial. Both of them were convicted. Both of them were black. And one of them was executed. Before the second brother could be executed, the North Carolina Confederate government falls. and you get a federal occupation of the state, and the Union general in control of the region declared the trial to be unfair. Because it was conducted under a Confederate court, it was technically illegal, and so he ordered a new trial. The new trial went forward. Once again, Henderson is convicted of rape, and once again he's condemned to die. But yet again, the Union general will intervene and say that this trial was unfair, that it was a kangaroo court, this individual deserves a fair trial. So once again, he was scheduled for another trial, and before the third trial could happen, the Cooper brother dies or escapes. We don't really know. The prison that he was in burned to the ground. Perhaps that was the actions of a white mob trying to execute Henderson without the sanction of a court case. Perhaps it was a prison break on the part of Henderson to get out of prison and escape. We don't really know, but cases like Susan Daniels will be used by men like Ben Tillman to argue, see, what do you have here? But a Reconstruction government empowering black men and thereby threatening white families. That when black men gain political power, they use it to undermine the structure of white families, to gain access to white women. And because of this, Ben Tillman and others will argue, white men need to rally together to prevent black political participation and save the South from what they called black Reconstruction governments. The image on the right is a piece of propaganda published in a Pennsylvania newspaper, supposedly depicting the plight of white Southerners due to black misrule. Reconstruction governments, like I said before, were much more complicated than that. Its opponents often described Reconstruction governments as entirely controlled by black people, but the reality was much more complicated. There were lots of white legislators who participated in Republican governance within these states as well, but that overly simplistic vision tends to be what white opponents to Reconstruction governments portray. So what you have here are white people in this image, this piece of propaganda, who are working hard, toiling in the background to try and make a living. And black people in the foreground are misusing their freedom. As the opponents of Reconstruction governments argued, black people just didn't understand the responsibilities that came with freedom. They did not have the intellectual capacity to be able to run Reconstruction governments effectively. And so their argument was that white people of the South needed to be set free from the misrule of black Reconstruction, and the North ought to stop tyrannizing white Southerners by forcing black Reconstruction upon them. Now, after 1873, there are plenty of people in the North who are willing to entertain the idea that maybe the federal government ought to stop putting so much effort and so much money into changing the states of the former Confederacy. In 1873, there's a financial panic. And a panic in this day and age is just a fancy word for an economic recession or a depression. So what happens is there's a speculative bubble in railroad stock. There's a railroad company that everyone is convinced is going to be making lots of money. In this day and age, everyone assumed that railroad stock would always go up in value and never go down. And then, oops, people found out that the paper this railroad stock was written on was not worth the paper that it was written on. There was a massive sell-off. People who took out risky loans to buy this stock lost everything. And a lot of people worried that their banks had invested in this flim-flam stock, and they ran to the banks to try and pull out their savings, and before you know it, you get a widespread depression. Jobs are hard to come by, wages tend to decline, and after 1873, there are plenty of white Northerners who were saying, why is the federal government spending so much money on reconstructing the South? Maybe that money could be better spent on ending joblessness in the North. The problem for the Republican Party after 1873 is, one, that they were the party in power when the panic hit. And typically in American history, the party in power when a depression hits is the party that gets the blame. But also that they had been winning elections, as they put it at the time, waving the bloody shirt. The phrase waving the bloody shirt is a reference to Republicans' continual reference to the Civil War, saying that the Republicans were the party of loyalty, the party of union, and the Democrats were the party of secession and civil war. and so calling upon Northern voters to vote Republican because of that Civil War legacy. But after 1873, those calls to vote Republican because of the Civil War seemed to ring rather hollow. Why should we be voting for something that happened 8 years ago at this point? I need a job now. I'm unemployed. I can't find work. What are you going to do about that issue? Maybe I don't care so much about the Civil War anymore. Maybe I'm more concerned about how I'm going to find a job. And in the presidential election of 1876, the election is very close, and the election results come down to the voting totals from 3 states, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. In each of those states, there were contested results. In each of those states, the Republican Party claimed that they had won the statewide election. In each of those states as well, the Democratic Party claimed that they had won the statewide elections. And so there was an impasse. It wasn't clear who was going to win. In order for the Republican nominee to win the national election, he would have to get the electoral votes from all 3 of the states. In order for Samuel Tilden to win, the Democratic nominee, he would just have to win 1 of the states. Eventually, the deal that was struck said that the Democrats would accept the victory of Rutherford B. Hayes as President of the United States if he would also agree to end federal occupation of the states of the former Confederacy. He agreed to the terms. He was sort of inclined to do that anyway. He had already suggested in the run-up to the election that Reconstruction was old news and the federal government needed to find better things to do with its money. And so that was the deal that was struck. And often this federal election is seen as the end of Reconstruction in the South. But the reality is that black resistance to white supremacy in the South does not come to an end in 1876 simply because the federal government pulled out the last remaining federal troops. We'll see going forward that it becomes very hard for black people to form some sort of resistance to white supremacy in the region without some sort of federal support. But it doesn't mean that black people stopped resisting white supremacy in various ways. One problem in the states of the former Confederacy is that the economic conditions of the region were just abysmally bad. Prior to the Civil War, cotton was king. The biggest export out of the U.S. for most of the years leading up to the Civil War was cotton. Cotton had a huge market in Britain, but then during the Civil War, cotton prices took a dip. And Britain was able to find other markets from which they could gain cotton, places like Egypt. And so once the Civil War came to an end and the South was now reopened for business and could export its cotton without having to face a federal blockade, many Southerners found that those markets were not willing to pay what they used to pay for their cotton. And so a lot of former slaves wanted to resist the idea of wage labor. Many former slaves were very anxious to not become wage laborers because it would mean during the hours of 9 to 5 during the day, whenever you were under the employ of the owner, you were under his direction. He could tell you what to do. Your time was his. So the general negotiation was one in which there was a crop sharing plan. The owners of the land, who were typically white, would agree to allow black farmers to till the land in exchange for a share of the crop at the end of the season. Depending upon what black farmers brought to the table, in other words, if they had a large family or if they had a mule to help till the fields, they could keep a bigger share for themselves. Those with fewer resources would be able to keep a smaller share for themselves and make a profit for themselves that way. At least in the early years of Reconstruction, it seems like a fairly reasonable bargain in the absence of actual land redistribution. But over time, cotton prices did not recover, and a lot of these sharecroppers discovered that this was a losing bargain, that the expenses of planting the crops, the expenses of life and feeding a family simply did not match the profits gained from the cotton crop at the end of the season. Over time, black farmers and white farmers as well would take out loans on the promise of what the crop would look like at the end of the season. But the reality, particularly for black families, was that this was a permanent debt peonage system. That for many of these people, there was simply no escape from the looming debts that built year after year after year. Now, for many people in the South, there are some calls towards some sort of industrial change. cotton before the Civil War had tended to prevent industrialization in the South because the profits were so immense. But after the Civil War, when cotton prices just simply aren't what they used to be, there are increasing calls for the South to industrialize. One of the biggest proponents of this is a journalist named Henry Grady, who reflects upon all the great things the South could be producing but doesn't. He asks this in this excerpt from his writing here, why is it that the South, with so many resources, focus solely upon agriculture? In this sort of hypothetical grave being dug for a southern sharecropper, everything's coming from the North. The iron, the stone, all of this stuff coming from the North, but the South, he says, is perfectly capable of producing this stuff too. And in fact, the calls for this new economic order and new industrialization in the South will in fact have some tangible changes. The South will create a number of textile mills. By the early 20th century, the South is producing more fabric than northern factories. You get a lot of tobacco rolling. Tobacco rolling factories, particularly out of central North Carolina, places like Durham, become the home of Lucky Strike tobacco. And lots of black and white Southerners will move to the cities after the Civil War because of the lack of opportunities in the rural parts of the South. Urban centers in the South grow quite tremendously. The reality in a lot of these factories, however, is that the best jobs were only available for white people. Black people tended to be relegated to service sector jobs that were not directly connected to production, but more on the line of janitorial kind of jobs. Now, as I said before, there are plenty of people in the states of the former Confederacy who continue to resist white supremacy even after the federal government pulls out the last remaining federal troops. One of those individuals is Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was a journalist working in Memphis when three of her friends were murdered. These three friends were grocers in the city of Memphis. A number of white grocers didn't appreciate their competition within the city, and there were a number of street brawls. One of these street brawls resulted in charges of assault against these three friends, Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and William Stewart. They were arrested, and before the trial could happen, they were pulled out of the jail, murdered in the streets, and McDowell, after he had been murdered, had his eyes gouged out. Ida B. Wells was outraged. She reflected upon the use of lynching in the South, which was growing in the 1880s and 90s. And she said most of these lynchings, the claim is that these people were lynched because of some sort of a crime, that they were arrested on the crime of murder. One of the largest reasons why people were lynched in the South was because of the supposed rape of somebody. About a quarter of the people who were murdered by mobs were murdered either because of an accusation of rape or attempted rape. But Ida B. Wells says that's just a surface facade. The claim is that these people are being murdered by mobs because of some crime that they've committed, but the reality is that this is a political tool, that this is a device used by white Southerners to intimidate and tyrannize black Southerners, and to keep them from challenging the dominance of white Southerners. So she publishes extensively about the use of lynching as a political tool. Eventually, she's forced to flee for her life. She gets enough death threats in Memphis that she eventually moved to Chicago. Now, when we talk about lynching in the South, lynching was not just in the South, by the way. There were lynchings around the country, but some of the states with the largest numbers of lynchings between 1880 and 1968 did come from the South. States like Alabama saw over 500 people lynched. These lynchings were outrageous for black Southerners and black Northerners. Many of them, like Ida B. Wells, recognized that this was a veneer of justice, but a reality of political domination, a tool to tyrannize the black population and to keep them from challenging white supremacy in the region. In 1892 as well, the individual on the slide in front of you was working with others in Louisiana to challenge Jim Crow laws there. In many of the states, once you see the restoration of white supremacist governments in the region, Many of these states passed laws that barred integrated facilities. In the state of Louisiana, there was a law in the books that prevented integrated rail cars. There had to be segregated rail cars that the railroads ran for black passengers and for white passengers. One of the opponents of that is Homer Plessy. Homer Plessy was of mixed ancestry. Because of the rules of the state, he would have been forced to buy tickets on the black rail car. So he intentionally violated the law, bought a ticket on the white rail car, was arrested because he and his allies wanted to challenge this law in the courts. Their argument was that the 14th Amendment should empower the federal government to stop these kinds of laws. They felt this was a clear violation of the equal rights guaranteed within the states by the federal government under the 14th Amendment. There were a number of cases leading up to this that sort of established precedents that made it challenging for the federal government to oppose these Jim Crow laws. But the Plessy versus Ferguson case becomes famous for the national government declaring it's not going to intervene in states to prevent these Jim Crow laws in the future. What the Supreme Court says in its ruling is that this is no violation of the 14th Amendment, that states have policing powers to try and keep the peace. And in Louisiana, the argument of the state in this case was that this particular segregation law was passed to prevent riots. Their argument was when black and white people inhabited the same space, that the inevitable result would be a riot of some kind. So they argued that the state of Louisiana had no choice but to pass this law in order to prevent racial violence. The Supreme Court essentially bought that and said, yes, states can create segregated facilities between black and white residents in the name of keeping the peace and preventing violence. But the Supreme Court said it has to be equal facilities. So if you're having schools, they have to be equally well funded. If you have separate accommodations, those accommodations have to be available and of equal quality. And that the mere suggestion of separation is not a suggestion of inferiority. That as long as those two facilities, the black facility and the white facility, are of equal quality, then there is no suggestion that there's any sense of inferiority there. On the slide in front of you is a picture of the person after the death of Frederick Douglass in 1895, who becomes the probably most prominent face of the black freedom struggle by the end of the 19th century, Booker T. Washington. He founds the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, a sort of industrial arts school to train black people in various trades so that they can become more economically competitive. And he gives this rather famous speech in 1895 in Atlanta during what we would probably consider today to be kind of like a World's Fair. It was called the Atlanta State and International Exposition. And in this speech, he says, it becomes known as the Compromise Speech. He says that black people need to cast down their buckets where they are. It's metaphorical language that is a little bit vague and probably intentionally vague, but the suggestion is that black people need to stop resisting segregationist rules that were being passed in states like Louisiana, and instead focus on racial uplift economically. At least that's what many white audiences heard within Booker T. Washington's speech. It's probably emblematic of how terrible the conditions were for people of color in the states of the former Confederacy by the end of the 19th century, that Booker T. Washington has to adopt this kind of compromise language and abandon the goal, which had been the goal up to and during the Civil War, of black equality and black equal participation in political matters and voting and in juries, and instead adopt the more limited goal of racial uplift through economic growth. Even that tended to outrage a number of white audiences, including Ben Tillman. Booker T. Washington's going to be the first black man to be invited to dine at the White House as a guest. Teddy Roosevelt, when he became president, invited Booker T. Washington to the White House to dine. Roosevelt was anxious to get Washington's support in exchange for certain patronage appointments within the federal government that would be allotted to black people. He wanted to make sure that when the next time there was a Republican convention, Washington would steer the black representatives towards renominating Teddy Roosevelt for president. But the idea of a black man being invited to the White House outraged Senator Ben Tillman. And using language that would have been no surprise to Ida B. Wells, you see the quote in front of you indicating that Ben Tillman argued that inviting Booker T. Washington to the White House to dine was going to result in white Southerners having to use violence and murder to prevent black people from enjoying any sorts of sense that they might be the equal of white people in the South. So Ben Tillman in this particular quote throws off the veil of legitimacy that had been given to lynching by many of its apologists in the South, and reveals the explicitly tyrannizing shape of what lynching was really all about, to inspire fear, to prevent black political participation. Now, there are certainly plenty of participants in the black freedom struggle by the end of the 19th century who are very much opposed to the kind of compromised perspective of Booker T. Washington. One of the more outspoken opponents of Booker T. Washington is this person here, William Monroe Trotter. He was a graduate of Harvard and became the editor of a newspaper in Boston called The Guardian. When Booker T. Washington came to Boston to give his presentation, Trotter and many of his friends heckled him from the gallery. They very much resented the way in which Washington appeared to have abandoned calls for black political empowerment, black political equality, and they wanted to let him know about it. Trotter was arrested, and eventually he becomes involved in the formation of the NAACP, although he does not stick with the organization. First it was called the Niagara Movement, and eventually it becomes the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. But as another black activist, W.E.B. Du Bois, described Trotter, he was simply impossible to work with from W.E.B. Du Bois's perspective. So he may have been involved in the early stages of its formation, but eventually forms his own rival organization and eventually dies by the beginning of the 1920s. And so, as I said at the beginning of this section, the Confederacy certainly lost the war, but one could make a convincing argument that by the dawn of the 20th century, the Confederacy had won the peace. That what seems to have been particularly effective was this argument that black Reconstruction resulted in misrule, that white Southerners suffered when black people were allowed to participate in politics. Historians at this period writing about Reconstruction tended to buy into that argument and portray black Reconstruction governments as corrupt, as inept, to justify the denial of black political participation in the region. And it's no mistake that a lot of the Civil War memorials to the Confederacy that went up in the 19-teens, including this one in St. Louis Forest Park in 1915, went up in this period. That the Confederacy had managed to re-identify itself not as a traitorous movement to try and undermine the United States, but as patriots fighting for their own cause to preserve the Southern way of life, as they framed it at that time. So in some ways, I think one could make a convincing argument that, yes, the Confederacy lost the war in 1865, and yet by 1915, when this memorial was going up in St. Louis, and similar memorials were going up around the country in honor of the Confederate soldiers, they had won the reinterpretation of the war and the Reconstruction era to justify the exclusion of black people from political participation.